The September wind cut through the Denver streets with an edge that promised winter wasn't far behind. Officer Marcus Rivera sat in his recliner, his left leg elevated and wrapped in the kind of medical apparatus that screamed career-threatening injury to anyone who'd spent time in law enforcement. The bullet had shattered his femur during what should have been a routine traffic stop 3 weeks ago. Now, instead of patrolling the neighborhoods he'd protected for 12 years, he was trapped in his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Thornton, watching the world through windows that felt more like prison bars with each passing day. At 38, Marcus had never imagined he'd be sidelined like this. The doctors said he'd walk again, maybe even return to duty, but the uncertainty gnawed at him worse than the constant ache in his leg. Tonight was particularly difficult. The painkillers made his head foggy, but without them, sleep was impossible. He'd been dozing fitfully in his chair when a sound cut through the quiet suburban night like a knife through silk. Howling. Deep, mournful, and desperate. It wasn't the casual barking of neighborhood dogs or the distant wail of coyotes that sometimes drifted down from the foothills. This was something else entirely. Something that spoke of profound loss and urgent need. Marcus shifted in his chair, wincing as his injured leg protested the movement. The howling came again, closer this time, and something about it made his police instincts sharpen despite the medication clouding his thoughts. As a cop, you learn to read desperation. It has its own frequency, its own particular urgency that cuts through all the background noise of daily life. This howling carried that same frequency, and despite his physical limitations, Marcus Rivera found himself reaching for the crutches that had become his unwelcome companions. Denver had been Marcus Rivera's beat for more than a decade, and he'd grown to love every corner of this sprawling city that stretched from the high plains to the Rocky Mountain foothills. He knew the rhythm of the neighborhoods, from the gentrified areas of Lodo, where young professionals sipped craft beer in converted warehouses, to the working-class districts where families like his own parents had built lives with calloused hands and unwavering determination. His own neighborhood in Thornton was a blend of both worlds. Starter homes mixed with established residences, young families alongside retirees, creating the kind of community where people still waved to their neighbors and kids could ride their bikes to the corner store. It was the kind of place where an off-duty cop could feel at home, where his uniform represented safety rather than suspicion. Marcus had grown up in Commerce City, just south of here, the son of a Mexican immigrant father who'd worked construction and an Irish-American mother who'd taught third grade for 30 years. They'd instilled in him a deep sense of justice tempered with compassion, values that had guided him through his years as a Denver police officer. He'd seen the worst of humanity during his career, but somehow he'd managed to hold onto the belief that most people were fundamentally good, that circumstances more than character often determined the choices people made. That belief had been tested many times, but never more significantly than 2 years ago on a cold February evening when he'd responded to a domestic disturbance call in the Elyria-Swansea neighborhood. The call had been routine enough, a neighbor reporting raised voices and what sounded like breaking glass from the apartment next door. Marcus had arrived to find James Kellerman, a 35-year-old construction worker, in the midst of what could only be described as a complete breakdown. Kellerman's wife had left him that morning, taking their 8-year-old daughter and most of their belongings. He'd come home from work to find the apartment stripped bare except for a few pieces of furniture and a note explaining that she couldn't handle his drinking anymore, couldn't watch him destroy himself and their family any longer. In his rage and despair, James had begun destroying what little remained, hurling dishes against the walls and punching holes in the drywall with his bare fists. By the time Marcus arrived, James was sitting on his kitchen floor, bleeding from cuts on his knuckles, surrounded by the debris of his collapsed life. The neighbor who'd called it in was pressing charges for disturbing the peace, and technically, Marcus had grounds for assault charges based on the property damage. The man was clearly drunk, clearly dangerous to himself if not others. But something about the scene had stopped Marcus from immediately reaching for his handcuff. Maybe it was the framed photo of a little girl with gap-toothed smile that had somehow survived the destruction, now lying face up on the linoleum like an accusation. Maybe it was the way James looked up at him with eyes that held more pain than anger, more desperation than defiance. Or maybe it was the medium-sized German Shepherd mix that cowered in the corner, its brown eyes darting between its master and the uniformed stranger as if trying to understand why its world had suddenly become so frightening. The howling came again, and this time Marcus was certain it was coming from his own front yard. He maneuvered himself to the window, pushing aside the curtain his ex-wife had hung 3 years ago, before their own marriage had become another casualty of the job's demands. The streetlight cast long shadows across his small lawn, but he could make out a shape near his mailbox. A dog, medium-sized, with the distinctive ears and coat pattern that made his breath catch in his throat. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. James Kellerman's German Shepherd mix, the same dog that had watched with terrified eyes as Marcus had made a decision that night 2 years ago that had haunted and inspired him in equal measure. Instead of arresting James Kellerman that February night, Marcus had done something that went against his training, against protocol, against every instinct that 12 years of police work had drilled into him. He'd looked at the broken man on the kitchen floor, at the photograph of the daughter who was already gone, at the dog that represented maybe the only loyal thing left in James's collapsing world, and he'd made a choice that would ripple forward in ways he couldn't have imagined. Marcus had helped James to his feet, had guided him to the bathroom to clean the blood from his knuckles, had sat with him at the kitchen table while James sobbed out his story between gasps for air that seemed too thin to sustain him. He'd listened as James talked about his father's drinking, about how he'd sworn he'd be different, about how work had been scarce and the bills were piling up and how the bottle had become first a comfort, then a necessity, then a master he couldn't escape. When the neighbor knocked on the door demanding to know what was taking so long, Marcus had stepped outside and explained that the situation was under control, that Mr. Kellerman was cooperating fully and would be seeking help for his problems. He'd asked the neighbor to consider dropping the charges, explaining that sometimes mercy served justice better than punishment. Back inside, Marcus had given James a choice. He could arrest him, process him through the system, add another mark to a record that would make finding work even harder. Or James could agree to attend AA meetings, to seek counseling, to check in with Marcus once a week for the next 6 months to prove he was serious about getting his life back on track. James had stared at him with disbelief, as if mercy was a concept so foreign he couldn't quite comprehend it. "Why would you do this for me?" he'd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus had looked around the destroyed apartment, at the photo of the little girl, at Rex who was slowly creeping closer as the tension in the room dissipated. "Because I think you're worth saving," he'd said simply. "And because that little girl in the picture deserves a father who's going to fight to get better." Now, 2 years later, Rex was in his front yard, howling with the same desperation that had filled that apartment the night Marcus had chosen compassion over consequence. The dog's presence could mean only one thing: James was in trouble. Marcus struggled to his feet, grabbing his crutches and making his way to the front door. Each step sent lightning bolts of pain up his injured leg, but something deeper than physical discomfort was driving him forward. The howling had stopped, but as he opened the door, he could see Rex pacing back and forth on his sidewalk, occasionally looking toward the house as if checking to see if his message was being received. The dog was thinner than Marcus remembered, his coat less lustrous, but his eyes held the same intelligence, the same loyalty that had impressed Marcus that night 2 years ago. When Rex saw him in the doorway, the animal's entire body seemed to sag with relief. The dog approached slowly, respectfully, stopping just within arm's reach and looking up at Marcus with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 words. "Hey, boy," Marcus said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. The dog's tail wagged once, briefly, but his body language remained tense, urgent. "Where's James, Rex? What's wrong?" As if understanding the question, Rex backed away from the house and looked down the street, then back at Marcus, then down the street again. The message was clear: follow me. Marcus's rational mind catalogued all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He was injured, barely mobile, had no backup, no radio, no way to call for help if the situation turned dangerous. He was off duty, technically on medical leave, with no authority to get involved in whatever crisis had sent Rex to his door. But his heart recognized something his mind couldn't quite articulate. This was connected to that night 2 years ago, to the choice he'd made to show mercy instead of dispensing justice. Rex began walking down the sidewalk, pausing every few steps to look back and make sure Marcus was following. The dog's gait was measured, patient, as if he understood that his human companion was moving slowly, painfully, but was determined to help nonetheless. The September night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the distant smoke from fireplaces that some optimistic residents had lit despite the relatively mild temperature. Marcus's neighborhood was quiet at this hour, porch lights casting pools of yellow warmth onto empty driveways, the blue glow of televisions flickering behind drawn curtains. It was the kind of peaceful suburban scene that reminded him why he'd chosen to serve and protect, why he'd dedicated his life to making communities like this safe for families to raise their children. Rex led him down Elm Street, past the Johnsons' house with its perfectly manicured lawn, past the Rodriguez's place where a child's bicycle lay on its side in the driveway, past the corner where Mrs. Chen always walked her ancient Pekingese at precisely 6:30 each morning. They were heading toward the less affluent part of the neighborhood, where the houses were smaller, older, where working people lived paycheck to paycheck and sometimes fell behind on the maintenance that kept properties looking pristine. Each step was agony for Marcus, but he pushed forward, driven by a mixture of professional instinct and personal investment in James Kellerman's story. Over the 6 months that James had checked in with him, Marcus had watched a broken man slowly piece his life back together. The weekly meetings had started awkwardly, James treating them like parole check-ins, suspicious of Marcus's motives and expecting the other shoe to drop. But gradually, as weeks turned to months, something like friendship had developed between them. James had kept his promise. He'd started attending AA meetings at the community center on Federal Boulevard, had found a sponsor who'd been sober for 15 years, had begun the slow, painful work of acknowledging the damage his drinking had caused. He'd gotten steady work with a roofing company, had moved from the apartment where his marriage had died to a small rental house in Marcus's neighborhood, had even started the process of trying to rebuild his relationship with his daughter through supervised visit. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. The angry, desperate man Marcus had found on that kitchen floor had gradually emerged as someone entirely different, or perhaps someone who had always been there beneath the alcohol and despair. James was intelligent, funny, surprisingly well-read for someone who dropped out of high school. He was also deeply committed to making amends, not just to the people he'd hurt with his drinking, but to the officer who'd given him a second chance when he deserved nothing but consequences. "I owe you my life," James had told Marcus during one of their last official check-ins. "I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. If you'd arrested me that night, if I'd gone through the system, I would have lost my job, my house, any chance of seeing my daughter again. I would have drunk myself to death within 6 months." Marcus had been uncomfortable with the gratitude, insisting that James had saved himself, that all Marcus had done was provide an opportunity. But privately, he'd been proud of the choice he'd made, proud of the man James had become, proud of the validation that sometimes mercy really could change everything. Now, following Rex through the darkened streets, Marcus wondered what had gone wrong. Had James started drinking again? Was he in some kind of medical emergency? Had something happened with his daughter, or his ex-wife, or his job? The possibilities churned through Marcus's mind as he struggled to keep up with the dog's determined pace. They turned onto Maple Street, a narrow residential road lined with small post-war homes that had seen better decades. Many were well maintained by proud owners who'd lived there for generations, but others showed the wear of transient renters and absentee landlords. Rex led him toward a pale yellow house near the end of the block, its small front yard bordered by a chain-link fence that had seen better years. Marcus recognized the house immediately. This was where James had moved after leaving the apartment where his marriage had ended. He'd driven by a few times during their check-in period, had been pleased to see James keeping the yard tidy, the house in good repair. Now, in the dim streetlight, something looked wrong. The front door was standing open, a rectangle of darkness that suggested either carelessness or crisis. Rex had stopped at the front gate, which was also ajar, and was looking back at Marcus with eyes that seemed to plead for urgency despite the human's obvious limitations. The dog's entire posture radiated tension, the kind of alertness that suggested danger or at least serious trouble ahead. Marcus paused at the gate, his police training warring with his physical limitations. Protocol would dictate calling for backup, waiting for officers who could respond appropriately to whatever situation awaited inside that dark house. But Rex's presence suggested time might be critical, and Marcus's connection to James made this personal in a way that transcended professional protocol. He pushed through the gate, Rex immediately bounding ahead toward the open front door. As Marcus approached the house, he could smell something that made his stomach clench with concern, the metallic scent of blood, mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify. Not alcohol, which had been his first fear, but something chemical, medicinal perhaps. "James?" he called out as he reached the doorway. "James, it's Marcus Rivera. Are you okay?" No response came from the darkened interior, but Rex had disappeared inside, and Marcus could hear the dog moving around, his nails clicking on what sounded like hardwood floors. Taking a deep breath and shifting his weight to better accommodate his injured leg, Marcus stepped across the threshold into James Kellerman's house. The living room was neat, almost Spartan, furnished with the kind of second-hand pieces that suggested someone starting over from scratch but taking pride in what little they had. A small television sat on a wooden stand, surrounded by books that surprised Marcus with their variety. AA literature mixed with novels, biography, even some philosophy. A framed photograph of a young girl with James's eyes occupied a place of honor on the mantelpiece, the same daughter whose picture had survived the destruction of that apartment 2 years ago. But something was wrong with the scene. A coffee table had been overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. A lamp lay on its side, its shade askew, casting strange shadows across the room. Most concerning of all, there were dark spots on the hardwood floor that Marcus's experienced eye immediately identified as blood. "James!" he called again, louder this time, his voice carrying the authority that 12 years of police work had ingrained in him. "I'm here to help. Where are you?" This time he heard a response, faint but unmistakable, a groan of pain coming from what appeared to be the kitchen area toward the back of the house. Rex's barking suddenly resumed, urgent and insistent, coming from the same direction. Marcus made his way through the small living room, using his crutches to navigate around the overturned furniture. The kitchen was visible through an open doorway, and even from a distance he could see that something serious had happened here. Cabinet doors hung open, their contents spilled across the floor. A chair lay on its side, and there was more blood, much more, creating a trail that led toward the back door. But it was what he found next to the kitchen table that made his heart stop. James Kellerman lay crumpled on the linoleum floor, conscious but clearly in severe distress. His face was pale, almost gray, and his breathing was shallow and labored. There was blood on his clothes, though Marcus couldn't immediately identify its source, and his position suggested he'd either fallen or collapsed rather than lying down intentionally. Rex was beside his master, occasionally licking James's face and whimpering, as if trying to will him back to full consciousness through sheer canine determination. When the dog saw Marcus enter the kitchen, his tail wagged once, briefly, as if to say, "Thank God you came. Now please fix this." "Jesus, James, what happened here?" Marcus asked, immediately dropping to his knees beside the injured man, his own pain forgotten in the face of this crisis. Up close, he could see that James had suffered some kind of head injury, a gash along his temple that had bled significantly but seemed to have stopped actively bleeding. More concerning were the signs that suggested this hadn't been an accident: the overturned furniture, the scattered belongings, the way James's clothes were torn as if he'd been in a struggle. James's eyes focused on Marcus with difficulty, but when recognition dawned, his expression transformed from confusion to something that might have been relief mixed with embarrassment. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I didn't want. Rex must have gone to find you. I told him to stay, but he's too smart for his own good sometimes." "Don't worry about that," Marcus said, pulling out his cell phone to call 911. "Let's get you some help first, then we'll figure out what happened here." As he waited for the dispatcher to answer, Marcus did a quick assessment of James's condition with the basic first aid training that all police officers receive. The head wound was ugly but not life-threatening. More concerning was James's color and breathing, which suggested possible internal injuries. His pulse was rapid but steady, and he was conscious and coherent, which were good signs. 911, what's your emergency? This is Officer Marcus Rivera, badge number 4471. I need an ambulance at 847 Maple Street in Thornton. I have an adult male with head trauma and possible internal injuries, conscious and breathing, but needs immediate medical attention. As Marcus provided the necessary details to the dispatcher, James reached out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Marcus, listen to me," he said urgently. "It wasn't an accident. There were two guys, they broke in looking for money, drugs, anything they could sell. I tried to fight them off, but—" He gestured weakly at the destruction around them. The pieces began falling into place in Marcus's mind. This was a home invasion, probably committed by drug addicts looking for quick cash to fund their next fix. James's small house, his status as someone living alone, might have made him seem like an easy target. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that James, who'd fought so hard to get clean and rebuild his life, had become the victim of the same kind of desperation that had once consumed him. "Did they take anything?" Marcus asked, though he was more concerned about James's immediate medical needs than any property that might have been stolen. "I don't think so," James replied, his voice growing stronger as shock began to wear off. "Rex scared them off before they could grab much. Started barking and snarling like he was going to tear them apart. They ran out the back door, but not before one of them threw me into the table pretty hard." Marcus looked at Rex with new appreciation. The dog had not only protected his master from potentially worse harm, but had then had the intelligence and loyalty to seek help from the one person James had talked about most during his recovery, the police officer who'd given him a second chance. The sound of sirens began to grow louder in the distance, and Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Help was coming, James was going to be okay, and the immediate crisis would soon be handled by people with proper equipment and training. But as he knelt on the kitchen floor next to the man he'd chosen to show mercy 2 years ago, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by the profound connections that had led to this moment. If he'd arrested James that night, if he'd followed protocol and processed him through the system, none of this would have happened exactly this way. James might be dead from alcohol poisoning, or in prison, or living on the street. He certainly wouldn't be in this house, rebuilding his life one day at a time. And Rex wouldn't have known to come find the one person who'd shown his master kindness when kindness seemed impossible. But beyond the immediate circumstances, Marcus was struck by something deeper. The way mercy had created bonds that transcended the normal boundaries between police officer and citizen, between law enforcement and the people they served. By choosing compassion over consequence that February night, Marcus had become part of James's story in a way that went far beyond his professional duties. The paramedics arrived with the efficiency that Marcus had witnessed countless times during his career, but never as a person whose friend was being loaded onto a stretcher. They worked quickly to stabilize James, checking his vital signs, cleaning and bandaging his head wound, asking the kinds of questions that would help them determine whether he had a concussion or more serious brain injury. "Any loss of consciousness?" one of them asked. "I don't think so," James replied, though his voice was still weak. "I remember the whole thing, unfortunately. Just felt dizzy and sick after I hit the table. Nausea, blurred vision, confusion? A little nausea, but my vision's okay. I'm not confused, just angry as hell that this happened." Marcus rode with James in the ambulance, Rex in the back seat of his pickup truck following behind, driven by one of the responding officers who'd volunteered to help. At Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, Marcus found himself in the strange position of being both a patient, still recovering from his own injuries, and the closest thing James had to family in the immediate area. The emergency room staff was efficient and thorough, ordering X-rays and a CT scan to rule out serious internal injuries or brain trauma. While they waited for results, James and Marcus sat in a quiet corner of the waiting area, Rex lying at their feet with the resignation of a dog who'd learned that hospitals were places where humans went to get fixed, but where the waiting seemed to last forever. "I need to tell you something," James said during a lull in the medical activity. "About why those guys targeted my house, I mean." Marcus looked at him with concern, wondering if there was more to this story than a random home invasion. "What do you mean?" "They knew me," James said quietly, his voice heavy with shame. "Not personally, but they knew my history. One of them said something about how I used to be a regular customer back in the day, how I probably had cash or pills stashed somewhere since I'd been clean for so long." The implications hit Marcus immediately. James was being targeted because of his past, because people who'd known him during his drinking days assumed he might have transitioned from alcohol to drugs, or might keep money around to avoid the banks and credit cards that could track someone trying to stay off the radar. "That's not your fault," Marcus said firmly. "You can't control what other people think they know about you, and you sure as hell can't control people who make the choice to commit crimes." "I know that intellectually," James replied. "But it doesn't change the fact that this happened because of who I used to be. Because of choices I made when I was drinking." Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about the complex ways that past decisions continue to shape present circumstances, even for people who'd worked hard to change their lives. "You know what I think," he finally said. "I think this happened because some desperate people made bad choices tonight. What matters is how you handled it, and what happens next." The doctor emerged from the examination area with James's test results, and the news was better than it could have been. No internal bleeding, no signs of serious brain trauma, though he did have a mild concussion that would require monitoring for the next 24 hours. A few stitches for the head wound, pain medication for the bruises and soreness that would get worse before they got better, and instructions to return immediately if he experienced any worsening symptoms. "You're lucky," the doctor told James. "Whatever you hit it just wrong enough to make a mess, but just right enough to avoid serious damage." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Marcus realized they had a practical problem. James's house was a crime scene, at least temporarily, while the police processed evidence and took photographs. He couldn't stay there tonight, and with his limited support system, he didn't have many options for alternative accommodations. "You're staying with me," Marcus said, in a tone that didn't invite argument. "At least until tomorrow, until we can figure out next steps and make sure your house is secure again." James started to protest, to insist that he didn't want to impose, especially on someone who was dealing with his own recovery from injury. But something in Marcus's expression stopped him. Perhaps the recognition that this offer came from the same place as the mercy that had been shown 2 years ago, from a fundamental belief in the importance of human connection and mutual aid. The drive back to Marcus's house was quiet, both men exhausted by the events of the night and processing what had happened in their own ways. Rex sat in the back seat, alert but calm, as if satisfied that his mission had been successful and his humans were now safe. Marcus's house felt different with James and Rex as guests, less empty, more purposeful. He set up the spare bedroom that had been gathering dust since his divorce, found extra pillows and blankets, made sure James had everything he needed to rest comfortably despite his injuries. As they settled in for what remained of the night, James sat on the edge of the bed, Rex at his feet, and looked at Marcus with an expression that held 2 years' worth of gratitude and something deeper that might have been understanding. "You know what the strangest part of tonight was?" James said. "When those guys were in my house, when I was fighting them and knew I was probably going to get hurt, the first person I thought of was you. Not because I wanted you to rescue me, but because I kept thinking about how disappointed you'd be if I got myself killed after all the faith you'd shown in me." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest, a recognition of the profound responsibility that came with showing mercy, with investing in another person's potential for redemption. "You didn't let me down," he said simply. "You protected your home, you survived, and when you needed help, you had someone to turn to. That's not failure, James. That's what community looks like." They talked for another hour, about the home invasion, about James's recovery, about the strange way their lives had become intertwined since that February night 2 years ago. Eventually, exhaustion won out over conversation, and they retreated to their respective rooms, leaving Rex to patrol the house with the vigilance of a dog who'd learned that sometimes danger could find even the safest places. Marcus lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the events that had brought them to this point. His injured leg ached, a reminder of his own vulnerability and the unpredictable dangers that could change everything in an instant. But more than that, he was struck by the profound interconnectedness of their stories, the way one act of mercy had created ripples that were still spreading outward in ways he couldn't have anticipated. If someone had told him 2 years ago that he'd someday be sharing his house with the man he'd chosen not to arrest, that their lives would become intertwined through crisis and recovery, through mutual aid and genuine friendship, he might not have believed it. But here they were, 2 men who'd found themselves broken in different ways, helping each other heal through the simple but radical act of showing up for each other when showing up mattered most. The next morning brought the practical business of dealing with the aftermath of a crime. Marcus and James returned to the house on Maple Street to meet with detectives, to walk through what had happened, to assess what needed to be repaired or replaced. The damage was significant but not devastating. Furniture could be upright, belongings could be organized, locks could be changed, and security could be improved. More importantly, the investigation revealed that James's attackers had been arrested later that same night during an attempted break-in 3 neighborhoods over. They were known to police, repeat offenders whose drug habits had driven them to increasingly desperate measures to fund their addictions. They would likely face serious charges, and James wouldn't have to worry about them returning. As they worked to restore order to James's house, Marcus found himself thinking about the cyclical nature of desperation and mercy, of how addiction created victims on all sides of the equation. The men who'd attacked James weren't evil, any more than James had been evil during his own worst moments. They were people whose choices had been narrowed by addiction until violence seemed like the only option left. "I keep thinking about them," James said, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "The guys who did this. A year ago, I would have wanted them to rot in prison, would have been furious that someone had violated my space and threatened my safety. But now, all I can think about is how they're probably going through what I went through. How desperate they must be." Marcus looked at his friend with something that might have been pride. This was what redemption looked like, he realized. Not just personal transformation, but the development of empathy that extended even to those who'd caused harm. James had moved beyond his own recovery to a place where he could see the humanity in people who'd hurt him. "What do you want to do about that?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about where this insight might lead. "I don't know yet," James admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I keep thinking about how different my life would be if you hadn't seen something worth saving in me that night. Maybe there's a way to pay that forward." Over the following weeks, as both men continued their respective recoveries, their friendship deepened in ways that transcended the original circumstances that had brought them together. Marcus found that having James and Rex around during his medical leave made the forced inactivity more bearable, gave him a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own healing. James, meanwhile, threw himself into not just rebuilding his house but rebuilding his life with even greater intentionality than before. The home invasion had been traumatic, but it had also been a reminder of how much he had to lose now, how much his life was worth protecting and preserving. He started volunteering at the community center where he'd attended his first AA meetings, sharing his story with newcomers who were still struggling with the decision to get sober. He talked about the police officer who'd shown him mercy when mercy seemed impossible, about the second chance that had made all the difference, about the importance of having someone believe in your potential even when you couldn't see it yourself. Marcus, when his medical leave ended and he returned to limited duty, found that his experience with James had changed his approach to police work in subtle but significant ways. He was still committed to public safety, still understood the importance of consequences for harmful behavior, but he was more attuned to opportunities for intervention that might prevent crime rather than simply respond to it. He started working with community organizations focused on addiction recovery, offering his perspective as a law enforcement officer who'd seen how mercy could sometimes accomplish what punishment couldn't. He talked about the ripple effects of choosing compassion over consequence, about the way investing in one person's recovery could create benefits that extended far beyond that individual. The story of Marcus and James began to spread through the community, told in AA meetings and church basements, in community center gatherings and neighborhood watch meetings. It became a parable of sorts, an example of what was possible when people chose to see each other's humanity rather than simply their mistakes. Rex, for his part, seemed to understand his role as a bridge between these two worlds. He remained loyal to James, but had clearly adopted Marcus as part of his pack as well. The dog would spend his days at James's house, but several evenings a week he would show up at Marcus's door, as if checking to make sure his extended family was safe and well. 6 months after the home invasion, James received a letter that changed everything once again. His ex-wife was moving back to Denver with their daughter, and she wanted to discuss the possibility of James having more regular visitation, maybe even shared custody if he continued to demonstrate stability and sobriety. She says she's been hearing things, James told Marcus over dinner one evening. Good things. About the work I've been doing, about how I handled what happened here, about the kind of man I've become. She says maybe it's time to give our daughter the chance to know her father again. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same emotion he'd experienced that night in the hospital when James had talked about not wanting to disappoint him. This was what mercy looked like when it had time to grow and develop, when it was nurtured by good choices and genuine effort and the support of people who believed in redemption. "How do you feel about that?" Marcus asked. "Terrified," James admitted. "And grateful. And determined not to screw this up." He paused, looking at Rex, who was sleeping peacefully by the fireplace. "You know what she told me? My ex-wife? She said the thing that convinced her I'd really changed was what happened that night with the break-in. Not how I handled being attacked, but how Rex knew to come find you. She said any man whose dog trusts him enough to seek help for him, and trusts his friends enough to lead them back in a crisis, is probably a man who's worth trusting again." Marcus laughed, the first genuinely joyful sound he'd made in months. "So Rex is the real hero of this story." "Rex is definitely the hero," James agreed. "But you're the reason there was a story to be the hero of, if that makes sense." The first visit with James's daughter went well, then better, then became a regular part of their weekly routine. 8-year-old Sarah was cautious at first, understandably wary of the father who'd been largely absent from her life during her most formative years. But children, Marcus observed, had a remarkable capacity for forgiveness when forgiveness was earned through consistent, loving behavior. Sarah adored Rex immediately, and the dog seemed to understand that his most important job now was helping to rebuild the trust between father and daughter. He would lie patiently while she dressed him up in her toy jewelry, would fetch sticks and frisbees in the backyard for hours, would curl up next to her during movie nights as if standing guard over her dreams. Marcus found himself included in many of these father-daughter activities, not as an intruder but as part of the extended family that had grown up around the foundation of mercy and second chances. Sarah called him Uncle Marcus, and he discovered that he loved teaching her about police work, about community service, about the importance of helping others whenever possible. One evening, as they sat in James's backyard watching Sarah play with Rex, James brought up something that had been on his mind for months. "I've been thinking about those guys who broke into my house," he said. "They're probably getting out of prison soon, and they're going to face the same challenges I faced when I was trying to get clean. No job, no support system, probably nowhere to live." Marcus had been wondering when this conversation would come up. He'd watched James's empathy develop over the months since the attack, had seen him struggle with the desire for justice and the understanding that justice without mercy often just perpetuated cycles of desperation and crime. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked. "I'm thinking maybe there's something we could do," James said carefully. "Not just for them, but for other people in similar situations. Some kind of program that offers people choices instead of just consequences." The idea that emerged from their conversations became the Second Chance Initiative, a partnership between the Denver Police Department, local addiction recovery services, and community organizations focused on reentry support for people leaving prison or trying to break free from cycles of addiction and crime. The program was simple in concept but revolutionary in practice. Instead of arrest and prosecution for certain non-violent crimes, offenders could choose to participate in intensive rehabilitation and community service programs. They would be paired with mentors, provided with job training and placement assistance, and given the kind of support system that made sobriety and stability possible. Marcus used his position within the police department to advocate for the program, drawing on his own experience with James to demonstrate how mercy could sometimes accomplish what punishment couldn't. James used his story and his credibility within the recovery community to recruit mentors and provide peer support for program participants. The program started small, with just a handful of participants and volunteers, but the results were remarkable. People who might otherwise have been processed through the criminal justice system were instead given the tools and support they needed to address the underlying issues that had led to their criminal behavior. Not every story was a success. Some participants relapsed, some reoffended, some simply disappeared back into the cycles of addiction and desperation that the program was trying to break. But enough people were helped, enough lives were changed, enough families were reunited, that the program began to attract attention from other communities interested in similar approaches. 3 years after that September night when Rex's howling had broken through Marcus's painkiller-induced sleep, the Second Chance Initiative had helped more than 200 people avoid incarceration and find paths toward stability and recovery. The program had been featured in law enforcement journals, replicated in other cities, and recognized as a model for community-based alternatives to traditional criminal justice approaches. But more than the statistics and recognition, Marcus treasured the individual stories that emerged from the program. People like Maria, a single mother whose shoplifting had been driven by her inability to afford groceries for her children, who had used the program's job training to become a certified nursing assistant and was now studying to become a registered nurse. People like David, whose drug addiction had led to a series of break-ins, who had found sobriety through the program and was now working as a counselor for other people struggling with addiction. Each success story reinforced Marcus's belief that mercy, when combined with accountability and support, could create transformations that punishment alone never achieved. Each person who chose recovery over recidivism validated the choice he'd made that February night 2 years ago, when he'd looked at a broken man in a destroyed apartment and decided to see potential rather than just problems. On a warm October evening, exactly 4 years after the night that had started everything, Marcus and James sat on Marcus's front porch, watching Sarah teach Rex a new trick while the sun set behind the Rocky Mountains that formed Denver's western horizon. Marcus's leg had healed completely, allowing him to return to full duty, though he'd chosen to focus his career on community policing and crime prevention rather than traditional patrol work. James was thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible during his darkest days. He had steady work, a comfortable relationship with his ex-wife, shared custody of Sarah, and a sense of purpose that came from helping other people navigate the path from desperation to redemption. His house on Maple Street had been transformed from a crime scene back into a home, with new security measures but also new warmth, new memories that gradually replaced the trauma of that September night. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Rex hadn't come to find you that night? James asked, as they watched the dog patiently allow Sarah to balance a treat on his nose. Marcus considered the question, thinking about all the ways their lives might have unfolded differently. I think about it sometimes, he admitted. But I try not to spend too much time on what-ifs. I'd rather focus on what actually happened, what we actually accomplished. What we accomplished together, James corrected. None of this works if it's just one person making good choices. It only works when people choose to help each other, to see each other's humanity, to believe in each other's potential for change. As if sensing the serious nature of their conversation, Rex abandoned Sarah's training session and trotted over to the porch, settling himself between the two men with the contentment of a dog who knew he was exactly where he belonged. Sarah followed, climbing into her father's lap with the casual affection of a child who had learned to trust again. "Uncle Marcus," she said, using the title that never failed to warm his heart, "Daddy says you saved his life. Is that true?" Marcus looked at James, then at the little girl whose father's recovery had made this moment possible, then at Rex whose loyalty had bridged the gap between crisis and rescue. "Your dad saved his own life," he said finally. "I just helped him remember that it was worth saving." But as the evening deepened and the family prepared to head home, Marcus reflected on the profound truth that had emerged from their intertwined stories. Mercy wasn't just about forgiveness or second chances, though it included both of those things. Real mercy was about seeing the spark of goodness that existed in even the most broken people and fanning that spark into a flame that could warm not just one life, but an entire community. The howling that had awakened him that September night hadn't just been a dog seeking help for his master. It had been a call to something deeper, a reminder that the bonds forged by mercy and maintained by mutual care could create families that transcended blood, communities that transcended geography, and hope that transcended even the most desperate circumstances. Rex's message that night had been simple but profound. Someone needs help, and you're the one who can provide it. The response Marcus had chosen, despite his own injuries and limitations, had created ripples that were still spreading outward, still creating opportunities for redemption and transformation, still proving that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply show up when showing up matters most. As James loaded Sarah and Rex into his pickup truck for the short drive home, Marcus stood on his porch and watched his chosen family disappear into the Denver night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose mercy over consequence, new chances to invest in the potential for human redemption. But tonight, he was content to stand in the warm October air and listen to the peaceful sounds of his neighborhood, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, other people were making choices that would ripple forward in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The injured officer had heard howling outside, and it had been the dog of the man he had forgiven. But more than that, it had been a call to the kind of love that shows up in crisis, that bridges the gap between past mistakes and future possibilities, that reminds us all that our stories are connected in ways we may never fully understand but should always cherish. In the end, that howling in the night had been the sound of hope itself, carried on the voice of a loyal dog who understood something that humans sometimes forget: that love is strongest when it's tested, that community is most important when it's most needed, and that mercy, once given, creates bonds that can withstand any storm.